Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling a question that's really fascinating. Why did the U.S. get involved in the Korean War?
It's a question that has so many layers to it. A lot going on.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can't just point to one single reason.
Right.
Right.
You have to consider the global context, the Cold War, the domestic pressures in the U.S.
Definitely, and of course the situation in Korea itself. It's a tangled web.
Definitely tangled. But that's why we're here, to try and untangle it. We've got a great lecture from a historian that's going to be our guide today.
Awesome. I'm excited to dig in. So to set the scene for our listeners, it's 1950. The Cold War is in full swing.
Right. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are locked in this ideological struggle, capitalism versus communism.
And the U.S.'s big strategy was containment, right?
Yeah.
Trying to stop communism from spreading any further.
Exactly. They saw it as a domino effect. If one country falls to communism, the next one will, and the next.
Like a row of dominoes. So were they really that worried about this domino theory? Or was it just propaganda?
Oh, they were definitely worried, especially after what happened in China in 1949 when the communists took over.
That must have sent shockwaves through Washington.
Absolutely. It really intensified the fear of communism spreading across Asia. And Korea, with its proximity to Japan, a key U.S. ally, was seen as a prime target.
Right. They couldn't afford to lose another country to communism.
Yeah.
Especially one so strategically important.
Exactly. And remember, Korea itself was already divided after World War II.
You had a communist North Korea and a U.S.-backed South Korea, both claiming to be the legitimate government of the whole peninsula.
A recipe for disaster, basically.
And then on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades the South. What was the reaction in the U.S.?
Total shock. It was seen as a direct challenge to the U.S. policy of containment. And with all the anti-communist hysteria going on, thanks to Senator McCarthy, Truman was under immense pressure to act.
Right. McCarthyism had created this atmosphere of fear and paranoia. Anyone who even questioned U.S. policy was labeled a communist sympathizer.
It was a toxic environment, and it definitely influenced Truman's decision-making.
So you got this international crisis, a divided Korea, a communist invasion, and then you've got this domestic pressure cooker in the U.S. with McCarthy and his allies. It's like a perfect storm.
It really was. And on top of all that, there's this top-secret document that comes into play, NSC 68.
Well, this sounds juicy. What's NSC 68?
Basically, it called for a massive increase in U.S. military spending and a much more aggressive stance against communism globally.
So Korea wasn't just about Korea. It was about the U.S. asserting itself as the leader of the free world.
Exactly. NSC 68 laid out this whole global strategy for the Cold War, and Korea became the testing ground for those ideas.
This is where it gets really interesting to me. This one document really sets the stage for decades of U.S. foreign policy.
It's incredible how much influence it had. But it's also important to remember that Truman wasn't just responding to pressure. He also genuinely believed in the UN.
So he saw this as a chance for the UN to prove itself, to show that it could effectively stop aggression.
Right. He believed in collective security and the idea that nations should work together to maintain peace.
It's amazing how many different motivations were swirling around in his head. Containment domestic politics, his faith in the UN, and this new global strategy outlined in NSC 68. No wonder historians are still arguing about his decision.
It's a historical puzzle. And to make it even more complex, there are different schools of thought about why the U.S. got involved.
There are different interpretations. Tell me more.
Well, there's the orthodox view, which basically says the U.S. was the good guy stepping in to save South Korea from communist aggression.
Right, the classic hero narrative.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are other views that challenge that.
Absolutely. The revisionist perspective argues that the U.S. was more interested in protecting its own interests in Asia, like Japan, and preventing the spread of communism to other countries.
So it's a more cynical view, seeing U.S. actions as driven by self-interest rather than altruism.
Right, but then you have the post-revisionists who try to find a middle ground. They acknowledge both the fear of communism and the role of U.S. self-interest.
Sounds like they're saying it's not black and white. There's a lot of nuance there.
Exactly. And then there's the new left perspective, which criticizes U.S. actions as imperialistic, seeing the Korean War as part of a larger effort to dominate the global capitalist system.
So they see the U.S. as more of a bully than a savior in this situation.
You could say that. It's a pretty radical interpretation, but it's important to consider all the different perspectives.
This is fascinating. I'm really curious to hear more about these different schools of thought. But first, let's take a closer look at how all these factors ultimately pushed Truman to send U.S. troops into Korea. All right, so we've got all this tension brewing. A divided Korea, the Cold War McCarthyism, And then Truman makes the call to send troops. What was that like?
Well, it was just 2 days after the North Korean invasion, June 27, 1950. Truman orders U.S. air and naval forces to support South Korea.
Wow, that's fast. So no declaration of war from Congress.
Nope. Truman justified his actions by pointing to the UN Security Council resolution condemning North Korea. It's interesting, though, because the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council at the time.
So the U.S. resolution just sailed right through. What a coincidence.
Right place, right time, I guess. But it raises the question, did Truman really believe in the UN? Or was he just using it as cover?
Yeah, I mean, he could have easily just gone in unilaterally.
Yeah.
Like America to the rescue.
Well, there's definitely evidence to suggest that he was sincere about the UN. He called it the UN's war. He really believed in collective security and the idea of nations working together to stop aggression.
That's kind of refreshing to hear, especially in the midst of all this Cold War paranoia.
Right. But at the same time, you can't ignore the political realities. The U.S. was determined to contain communism, and the UN resolution gave them a way to do it with international legitimacy.
So it's a mode of idealism and pragmatism, I guess, that describes a lot of foreign policy decisions.
For sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of pragmatism, we have to talk about NSC 68 again. Remember that top secret document?
Yeah, the one that called for a massive military buildup.
Yeah.
How did that tie into Truman's decision?
Well, NSC 68 really provided the justification for Truman's actions. It argued that the U.S. needed to be much more aggressive in countering the Soviet threat, not just in Korea, but globally.
So Korea became a testing ground for this new approach, a way to put those ideas into practice.
Exactly. It gave them a chance to flex their muscles, show the world that they were serious about stopping communism.
And it really set the stage for the next few decades of U.S. foreign policy, a more interventionist, militaristic approach.
You could say that, but let's not forget about the different schools of thought surrounding U.S. involvement. We touched on them earlier.
Right, the orthodox view, the revisionist view, and so on. Can we unpack those a bit more?
Absolutely. So the orthodox view, as we said, sees the U.S. as the good guy, stepping in to save South Korea from communist aggression. It emphasizes Truman's commitment to containment and defending democracy.
Right, the classic Cold War narrative. But then you have the revisionists who take a different view.
Yeah, the revisionists are more skeptical. They argue that the U.S. was primarily motivated by self-interest, protecting Japan, maintaining influence in Asia, and preventing the domino effect.
It's a more cynical interpretation,
Yeah.
but definitely worth considering.
For sure. And then you have the post-revisionists who try to find a middle ground. They say it's not just about communism or self-interest. It's a mix of both.
So they're acknowledging the complexity of the situation, the fact that there are multiple factors at play.
Exactly. And finally, there's the new left perspective, which is the most critical of U.S. actions. They see it as a form of imperialism and attempt to dominate the global capitalist system.
So from their point of view, the U.S. is the bad guy, exploiting Korea for its own economic and political gain.
Right. It's a very different way of looking at the war. But it's important to understand all these perspectives, to see the event from multiple angles.
Definitely. It helps us get a more complete picture of what really happened. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the war itself. How did it actually play out on the ground?
Well, it was a brutal conflict, lasted for 3 years.
Yeah.
Lots of back and forth fighting, massive casualties on both sides.
And the U.S. was initially successful, right? They pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel.
Yeah, they were making good progress. But then in late 1950, China entered the war.
Whoa, that must have been a huge turning point.
It was China sent hundreds of thousands of troops across the border. And suddenly the U.S. was facing a much larger and more determined enemy.
That must have been a shock. Did the U.S. see that coming?
Not really. General MacArthur, who was in charge of UN forces, completely underestimated China's willingness to intervene.
Yeah.
He thought they were bluffing.
Big mistake. So what happened next? Did the war just drag on indefinitely?
It did for a while. There was a lot of fighting, lots of casualties, and a few attempts at negotiation. But it wasn't until 1953 that an armistice agreement was finally signed.
So after 3 years of fighting millions of deaths, they basically ended up back where they started.
Pretty much. The boundary between North and South Korea was basically restored to the pre-war line, the 38th parallel.
What a tragic outcome.
Yeah.
All that suffering for nothing.
It's incredibly sad, especially for the Korean people who bore the brunt of the war. But even though it ended in a stalemate, the Korean War had a profound impact on the world, especially the U.S.
Right. It really cemented the U.S.'s role as a global military power. And it showed that they were willing to use force to contain communism.
Absolutely. It was a turning point in U.S. foreign policy, and the consequences are still being felt today.
It's really amazing when you think about it. The Korean War started as this small regional conflict, but it ended up having such a huge impact on the world.
Yeah, it's a great example of how seemingly isolated events can have these massive ripple effects.
And for the Korean people, it was just devastating. Their country was torn apart. Millions of lives lost or disrupted.
It's a tragedy that's often overshadowed by the larger Cold War narrative. But it's important to remember the human cost of the war.
Absolutely. Those individual stories should never be forgotten. But let's zoom out a bit and talk about the war's impact on the U.S. What were some of the long-term consequences?
Well, one of the most significant was the expansion of the U.S. military. Before Korea, the U.S. military was relatively small, but after the war, it became this massive global force.
Right, they had to ramp up their military capabilities to fight in Korea, and that kind of set the stage for the rest of the Cold War.
Exactly. The U.S. emerged from the Korean War as a military superpower with bases all over the world, and that had a huge impact on their foreign policy.
It's like they went from this isolationist stance to a more interventionist approach, always ready to step in and fight communism wherever it popped up.
And that shift in policy really shaped the second half of the 20th century. It led to U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the Middle East, all over the place.
It's fascinating how this one war, which technically ended in a stalemate, had such a lasting impact on the global landscape.
And of course, the Korean Peninsula itself is still divided today. It's a legacy of the Cold War, a reminder of that unfinished conflict.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that history isn't just something in the past. It continues to shape the present. So what are your final takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they move forward?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of understanding complexity. History is never black and white. There are always multiple perspectives, different interpretations of events.
Right, we shouldn't just accept the simple narratives. We need to dig deeper, question our assumptions, and be open to different viewpoints.
Exactly. And when it comes to the Korean War, I encourage everyone to keep learning. Read different accounts, explore the different historical interpretations, and consider the ongoing legacy of the war both in Korea and around the world.
That's great advice. We should never stop questioning, never stop learning. Well, this has been an incredible journey. I've learned so much, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you. Hopefully we've sparked some curiosity, inspired people to go out and do their own research.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop questioning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.